I used to think weddings were about love, about two people finally promising forever in front of the people they care about. I had dreamed of that moment for years, ever since I was a teenager flipping through bridal magazines in the checkout line at the grocery store. I imagined walking down the aisle in a dress that felt like it was made just for me, with flowers filling the room and everyone's eyes only on me and the man I chose to spend my life with. For so long, I carried that picture in my mind, waiting for the day when it would be real. And when the day finally came, when I got engaged to the man who made me feel seen, loved, and respected, I thought that dream was finally within reach. I had no idea that my parents, the people who raised me, would twist that dream into a nightmare I never could have imagined. From the beginning, my relationship with my parents was complicated. I wasn't the golden child. That role belonged to my sister. She was the one who seemed to do everything right. She got married young, had kids quickly, and lived close to my parents so they could see her all the time. I, on the other hand, focused on building a career first. I didn't get engaged until my early 30s, and to my parents, that already made me different. They made little comments about me waiting too long or being picky, but I brushed it off. I thought when it came time for my wedding, they would still support me. After all, I was still their daughter. But from the very first conversation about planning, I noticed something strange. They weren't excited for me. They seemed distracted, almost like they had another agenda. It started small. I told them about venues I liked, places I wanted to tour, and instead of talking about how beautiful they were or asking about the guest list, they brought up my sister's anniversary. "You know your sister's 10th anniversary is just a month before your wedding date," my mom said one night. "It's such a milestone. Wouldn't it be nice to celebrate both events together?" I laughed it off, thinking she was joking. Who in their right mind would combine a wedding and an anniversary party? They were two completely different occasions, but my mom wasn't smiling. She looked serious, and my dad nodded in agreement. "It would save money," he added. "One big event instead of two smaller ones, and all the family will already be here." I shook my head and said, "This is my wedding. It's not something I want to share. It's supposed to be my day." They didn't argue, but I could tell they weren't letting go of the idea. Over the next few weeks, every time I tried to bring up details about my wedding, my parents redirected the conversation back to my sister's anniversary. It became clear they were fixated on the thought of combining the two. I told my fiancé about it, and he frowned, saying, "That's not right. This is your moment, not some family reunion or joint party." He encouraged me to stand my ground, and I did, but the pressure from my parents kept building. My sister, of course, loved the idea. She called me one afternoon, gushing about how amazing it would be to share the spotlight and how our family could make memories together. But to me, it didn't feel like sharing the spotlight. It felt like my spotlight was being stolen. I wanted to be happy for her marriage and her anniversary, but I also wanted one day in my life where everything was about me. Was that too much to ask? The turning point came when my parents invited us to dinner. My fiancé and I thought it was just a casual family meal, but it turned into something else entirely. Halfway through, my mom pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. Inside were brochures, price quotes, and contracts from a hotel ballroom downtown. "We've been thinking," she said, "and we went ahead and reserved this place for both your wedding and your sister's anniversary party. It's perfect, plenty of space, elegant, and it will save so much money." I stared at her, stunned. They had made these decisions without even asking me. My fiancé looked at me, waiting for me to say something, and I finally managed to get words out. "You had no right. This is my wedding, not a joint event. How could you do this?" My dad tried to calm me down, saying it was for the best, but my hands were shaking. I felt like my dream day was slipping out of my grasp. I tried to pull away from their plan. I told them firmly that I wasn't agreeing to combine anything. I wanted my own wedding, my own venue, and my own guest list. But they kept pushing. My sister started sending me ideas for our shared decorations. My mom called me daily to talk about how the menu could reflect both occasions. My dad even suggested I change my vows to keep things short since we'll have 2 ceremonies to get through. The more I resisted, the more they acted like I was being selfish. It was as if I was the one ruining the family's happiness by not agreeing. The guilt weighed on me, and I started to wonder if maybe I was being unreasonable. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about saving money or convenience. This was about my parents putting my sister first, just like they always had. Tabi. Stress started affecting everything. My fiancé and I argued more, not because we were against each other, but because the weight of dealing with my family was exhausting. He told me we should just elope, skip the big wedding altogether, but part of me didn't want to give them that satisfaction. Why should I run away from my own wedding because my parents were overstepping? I wanted to fight for the day I had dreamed of. But every time I pushed back, my parents pushed harder. Finally, after weeks of tension, I gave in to at least look at the hotel venue they had chosen. I told myself I'd keep an open mind, even though I already hated the idea. The hotel was beautiful. I'll admit that. Crystal chandeliers, polished. Marble floors, staff that treated us like royalty during the tour. But every detail screamed anniversary gala, more than wedding. There were framed photos of other events on the walls, and none of them looked like the romantic, intimate wedding I had imagined. Still, my mom beamed as we walked through, pointing out how the stage could be used for both the anniversary speeches and the wedding ceremony. My sister joined us too, and she acted like it was already a done deal. She picked out color schemes, suggested a cake design with both her and her husband's names alongside mine and my fiancé's. I wanted to scream. I tried to picture myself walking down the aisle in that room, but all I could see was my parents and sister taking over every detail. When I finally said no, firmly and clearly, I thought that would be the end of it. But I was wrong. 2 weeks. Later, I got a stack of invoices in the mail. My name was on every single one. The venue deposit, the floral arrangements, the catering package, even luxury extras like limousines and an open champagne bar. The total was jaw-dropping, over $83,000. My chest tightened as I flipped through the papers. None of this had my signature. None of this had my approval. Yet somehow, everything was under my name. My parents had gone ahead, signed the contracts themselves, and told the vendors to bill me. I felt sick. I called my mom, my hands trembling, and demanded to know what this was. She sounded calm, almost smug. "You're starting a new life," she said. "Your sister already has hers. You can afford this more than she can. It's only fair." I shouted that it wasn't fair, that it was my wedding, not theirs, and I hadn't agreed to pay for everyone, but she brushed me off, telling me to stop being dramatic. That night, I broke down in my fiancé's arms. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and trapped. My parents had not only stolen my wedding, but also saddled me with a debt I couldn't possibly handle. $83,000. How could they do that to their own daughter? I felt like a pawn in their endless game of favoring my sister. For years, I had lived with the feeling of being second best, but this was different. This wasn't just emotional neglect. This was financial betrayal on a massive scale. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them ruin the most important day of my life without a fight. When the party actually began, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could push my anger aside and still enjoy my wedding day. After all, it was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. My dress fit perfectly, my husband looked incredible in his suit, and the ballroom looked like something from a magazine. But the second we walked into the room, it became clear it wasn't our day at all. Everywhere I looked, there were giant posters of my sister and her husband smiling together, framed photos of their past anniversaries, and even a slideshow of their wedding pictures playing on the big screen. Not one single photo of me and my husband had been set up. The decorations screamed anniversary more than wedding. And my name, my husband's name, our love story, it was barely mentioned. My stomach tightened with every step, but I tried to smile. Guests had flown in, people were clapping, and I told myself I could deal with it later. But the unease didn't stop there. As the reception went on, I noticed something else. Guests kept walking up to my sister and her husband first, congratulating them, handing them envelopes and gifts, hugging them like they were the stars of the night. My husband and I stood to the side like we were guests at our own wedding. I remember one distant relative saying, "It's so wonderful your family thought to combine this with your sister's anniversary. Such a beautiful way to celebrate both." I smiled politely, but inside I was screaming. This was supposed to be the one day of my life where the spotlight belonged to me and my husband. Instead, it felt like we had been shoved into the background of our own story. Then came the champagne toast. I was already on edge, but when my father stood up with a microphone, I nearly dropped my glass. He cleared his throat and said, "Tonight we honor not only the union of our daughter with her wonderful new husband, but also the lasting love of our eldest daughter and son-in-law." The applause was loud. My sister beamed, her husband kissed her cheek, and everyone clapped again. I glanced at my husband, who looked just as shocked as me. Our moment, our vows, our celebration had been watered down into a side note in someone else's highlight reel. My cheeks burned with humiliation. It felt like we had been robbed of our wedding and turned into supporting characters in someone else's party. Still, I tried to breathe through it. I told myself I'd let it slide until the night was over, then confront my parents. But later that evening, I noticed the waitstaff whispering and pointing toward me. Confused, I followed their glances and saw one of them holding a thick folder filled with invoices. My name was highlighted on the front. Curiosity and dread tangled in my stomach, so I walked up to the front desk of the hotel and asked to see what they were holding. That's when I nearly collapsed. The folder contained every single bill for the night: the catering, the flowers, the limo rentals, the music, the ballroom rental, even the open bar. And every single page had my full legal name printed at the top as the responsible payer: $83,000. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. $83,000. My wedding hadn't just been hijacked, it had been transformed into an $83K bill, placed entirely on my shoulders without me ever agreeing to it. I stumbled back into the ballroom, clutching the invoices, trying to steady my breathing. When I found my parents at their table, I asked them calmly, "Why is my name on every single bill? Why am I the one being charged for this entire event?" Mother barely flinched. She said, "Because you're starting your new life. Your sister already has hers. This is tradition. The bride's family handles the cost, and you're the bride. Besides, you're married now. You and your husband can afford it together." I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. My father added, "Think of it as an investment in family unity. You're lucky we even planned something this big for you." Lucky? I was lucky to be buried under $83,000 worth of debt? I felt my chest tighten as rage and betrayal surged through. You, my husband standing beside me, finally stepped in. His voice shook as he said, "We never agreed to this. You never asked us. You never told us. You just dumped it all under her name?" My parents exchanged looks like they couldn't understand why we were so upset. My sister, sitting smugly with her champagne glass, shrugged and said, "It's not a big deal. You'll figure it out. We had to pay for our own wedding too, you know." That was the moment something inside me broke. I wasn't just angry, I was done. Done being treated like I didn't matter, done being used, done being the one who always had to sacrifice for family. The rest of the evening blurred as I forced myself to sit through the speeches, the dancing, the cake cutting, all while holding back tears and rage. I smiled for photos that felt like a lie. I greeted guests who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, and I swallowed the humiliation of knowing this day wasn't mine at all. Later that night, when most guests had left and the ballroom was clearing out, I went straight to the hotel manager. My voice shook as I explained everything, that I had never signed a contract, that my parents had organized the event, that my name had been used without my consent. The manager listened carefully, then flipped through the documents with me. Sure enough, the signature lines on the contracts belonged to my parents, not me. The invoices had been prepared under my name because that's what my parents had instructed, but legally, I wasn't responsible. Legally, the contracts tied back to them, and them alone. The wave of relief that washed over me was indescribable. For the first time that entire night, I felt like I had a shred of power back in my hands. But I didn't stop there. I asked the manager to prepare copies of the contracts, highlighting the signatures, and I tucked them safely into my purse. I knew my parents would fight me, would try to guilt me, would try to spin the story as if I was ungrateful. But this time, I had proof. When I walked back into the ballroom with my husband, I felt a fire in my chest. My parents were laughing with some relatives, completely oblivious to the fact that their plan had just crumbled. I walked right up to them and said, "By the way, I just spoke with the manager. I'm not paying a single dime. You signed the contracts. You're the ones legally responsible, not me." Their smiles froze. My mother's face drained of color, my father's jaw tightened, and my sister nearly choked on her drink. The silence that followed was louder than any music that had played that night. My parents sputtered excuses, saying it wasn't fair, that they did all this for me, that I was ruining the family name by refusing to take responsibility. My sister jumped in, calling me selfish and dramatic, but I didn't back down. For the first time in years, I stood my ground. My husband put his arm around me, steadying me, and together we walked out of that ballroom without looking back. On the drive home, my phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from my parents, from my sister, from relatives, who had already heard the twisted version of the story they were spreading, but I ignored them all. I held my husband's hand tightly and told myself that this was the start of a new chapter, a chapter where I wouldn't let myself be used or manipulated anymore. Even though the night hadn't gone the way I dreamed, even though my wedding had been tainted with betrayal and lies, I felt stronger than I ever had before. Because now I knew the truth. Family doesn't mean letting yourself be a doormat. Family doesn't mean being forced to pay the price for someone else's greed. And sometimes, the only way to free yourself is to walk away, even if it means leaving everything behind. I don't think I had ever felt such a mix of anger and sadness as I did the morning after I saw those invoices. It was almost surreal, as if I had been watching someone else's life fall apart instead of my own. I woke up in the hotel suite with my husband beside me, still trying to wrap his arms around the shock we were both drowning in. He kept telling me that everything would be okay, that none of this was my fault. But I could see the same tension in his face that I felt in my chest. This wasn't supposed to be how our first days as a married couple began. We were supposed to be laughing about the ceremony, planning a short trip, and soaking in the glow of new beginnings. Instead, I felt like I was walking around with an anchor tied to my ankle, every breath heavier than the last. The day before had been chaos, arguing with my parents, watching them act as though this massive financial betrayal was some kind of normal family arrangement. I kept hearing my mom's voice in my head saying, "You're starting a new life. You can handle it." As if saying vows to the person I loved somehow magically deposited $83,000 into my bank account. The way they brushed it off, the way they minimized the pain I was feeling, cut me deeper than the financial part. It was the realization that they didn't care what this did to me. They didn't even care if I had signed the contract or not. They wanted the result they dreamed up, and they shoved it into my hands without thinking of what it might destroy. My husband tried to convince me to eat breakfast, but I couldn't bring myself to swallow anything. My stomach felt knotted, every nerve on edge. I knew I couldn't stay paralyzed in that room. I needed to act. That's when I called the hotel manager again. He had been kind the night before, listening patiently while I explained through tears that I had never signed a single paper. He had promised me that legally I wasn't responsible, but fear had this way of creeping back in, whispering, "What if?" So I went down to the lobby, hand in hand with my husband, ready to look the manager in the eye and hear the truth again. The manager met us in his office, a man in his 50s with the calm presence of someone who had seen 1,000 weddings before ours. He looked me straight in the eye and told me not to worry. "The contract has your parents' signatures, not yours," he said firmly. "That makes them liable, not you. We can't legally pursue you for payment." Hearing those words felt like air rushing back into my lungs after drowning. I wanted to collapse in relief, but I held it together. My husband squeezed my hand, and for the first time in days, I saw a glimpse of hope in his eyes. But relief didn't erase the betrayal. I still had to face my parents. I couldn't avoid them forever, though every part of me wanted to. When we finally met later that day, the tension could have cut through glass. My sister was there too, sitting silently, her face red and blotchy from crying. She wouldn't even look at me, and honestly, I wasn't sure if her tears were from guilt, shame, or anger that the plan had backfired. My parents, though, were a different story. They were furious, not at themselves, but at me. My father slammed his hand on the table, demanding to know why I had gone behind their backs to the hotel. My mother accused me of embarrassing the family, as though their deception had been perfectly respectable until I dragged the truth into the light. It was a strange, almost out-of-body moment for me. I expected myself to break down, to cry, again to try to defend myself with shaky words, but instead, I felt a cold strength rise up in me. I looked at them and said, "You used me. You wanted me to pay for your party, and you thought I wouldn't notice, or that I'd be too scared to say anything. That's not love. That's control. And I'm done being controlled." My words hung in the air like a heavy weight none of us could escape. My sister finally looked up at me then, and for a second, I thought she might apologize. But instead, she whispered, "We just wanted one big celebration. Why can't you see that?" That question broke whatever final thread of sympathy I had left. I realized then that none of them understood, or wanted to understand, the damage they had caused. They saw me not as family, not as a daughter, not as someone with her own life and limits, but as a resource to be tapped into whenever it suited their desires. My husband spoke then, his voice low but steady, saying, "She doesn't owe you anything. She's my wife now, and we're going to protect our life together." I think that was the moment my parents realized things had shifted for good, that I wasn't their puppet anymore. Leaving that room was harder than I imagined. A part of me still longed for their approval, for them to suddenly soften and say, they were wrong, but they didn't. They just sat there in anger, resentment written all over their faces. I walked out with my husband, my chest tight but my steps firm. For the first time, I chose myself over their expectations. The weeks that followed were complicated. Word spread quickly among family and friends, and the story twisted in a dozen directions depending on who told it. Some said I had abandoned my parents with a debt they couldn't handle, painting me as ungrateful. Others saw the truth and reached out to support me. It was strange to see how quickly people took sides, how easily judgment flowed when they weren't the ones staring at an 83,000 nightmare. My sister didn't speak to me for weeks, though I later heard from a cousin that she had been ranting to anyone who would listen that I ruined everything. Apparently, in her mind, Saving myself from crushing debt was equivalent to destroying her happiness. But in the middle of all the chaos, something beautiful grew between me and my husband. We became stronger together. Every time I felt guilt creeping back in, he reminded me that I hadn't done anything wrong. Every time I worried about what people thought, he reminded me that their opinions didn't pay our bills or build our marriage. We started carving out our own little bubble of peace, even as the storm raged outside. And slowly, I began to see the betrayal not as a curse, but as a kind of twisted gift. It forced me to draw a line I had been too afraid to draw before. One evening, weeks later, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was sharp, almost brittle. She told me that the hotel had officially demanded payment and that they were drowning trying to figure out how to cover it. She begged me to reconsider, to help just this once. For a brief second, the daughter in me wanted to give in, to rescue them. But then I thought about every night I had cried over this, every moment they had dismissed my feelings, every time they had chosen their pride over compassion. I told her no. It was the hardest no I'd ever said, but also the most freeing. She hung up on me, and I knew then that our relationship would never return to what it once was. But maybe that was okay. Maybe what it once was had never been healthy to begin with. I had spent years bending, sacrificing, trying to earn love by giving more and more of myself. This time, I chose to stand firm. As the months went by, the bitterness in my parents seemed to grow, but mine began to fade. I didn't want to carry their betrayal like a weight anymore. I wanted to step into my marriage with a lighter heart. I focused on building my new home, my new routines, and my new life. I poured energy into the people who genuinely cared about me, into friendships that gave instead of drained. And slowly, I felt myself healing. Still, there were nights when I'd lie awake, remembering the moment I first saw that bill, remembering the disbelief that turned into rage. It haunted me sometimes, the thought that my own family could so easily discard my trust. But each time I reminded myself, I survived it. I didn't let it bury me. And in walking away, I found strength I never knew I had. And maybe, in some twisted way, that was the real wedding gift my parents gave me. Not the nightmare bill, but the chance to finally choose myself and the life I wanted to build. Free from their control. I wish I could tell you that when the truth came out, everything ended neatly like in some kind of movie where justice was swift and clean. But life is never that simple. The moment the hotel manager looked me in the eye and said, "Legally, you're not responsible for this invoice, since you never signed the contract," I felt my knees weaken. Relief washed over me, but at the same time, a strange kind of sorrow seeped in. This wasn't how I imagined my wedding day. I thought it would be about vows and rings, about laughter with family and friends, about joy that would stay with me forever. Instead, it turned into a courtroom of emotions, with betrayal, deceit, and bitterness, filling the air thicker than the scent of roses that lined the tables. My parents were furious when they heard the manager's words. My mother's face went red with embarrassment, her voice raising high enough for the entire lobby to hear. "That's not fair. She was the bride. The celebration was for her. Of course it should be under her name." But the manager stayed calm, showing her the papers with her and my father's signatures. "Ma'am, this is a binding contract. Your daughter's name does not appear anywhere on it." My father clenched his jaw so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He had always been the kind of man who cared deeply about appearances, and, at that moment, his image of control, of authority, was slipping through his hands. I stood there watching them argue, and instead of feeling guilt, I felt a strange surge of empowerment. For once, I wasn't the one being pushed around. For once, they couldn't guilt me into compliance. They couldn't say, "Family comes first," or "You owe us," or "It's your duty." The law was on my side, and so was my new husband, who had been quietly holding my hand through the storm. He squeezed it then, reminding me that I wasn't alone anymore, that this was the beginning of something different, our life together. My sister, though, that was another story. She burst into tears the moment she realized the bill was falling on them. She kept saying it wasn't her fault, that she didn't know our parents had set everything up this way. And maybe that was true, but the bitter part of me couldn't help but notice how she had enjoyed the attention, the limos, the champagne, the extravagant setting. She basked in the spotlight during what was supposed to be my wedding. She never once turned to me and asked if it felt right, if I was okay sharing my moment. She loved the glamour, the luxury, the grandeur of it all. And now the cost of that glamour was a price tag neither she nor my parents had expected. The arguments carried late into the night. At one point, my father even shouted that I was ungrateful, that after everything they had done for me growing up, this was how I repaid them, by humiliating them in front of the hotel staff and our extended family. But his words no longer cut as deeply as they once did. For years, I had been taught to believe that gratitude meant obedience, that love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant silence in the face of unfairness. Standing there, in my wedding dress, with my husband by my side, I realized that gratitude doesn't mean becoming a doormat. Love doesn't mean losing yourself. Loyalty doesn't mean letting people exploit you. Eventually, the hotel manager asked us to take the discussion outside, as other guests were staring. So we stepped into the cool night air. I'll never forget that moment. My sister's makeup was streaked down her face. My mother's eyes were wild with panic. My father's voice was hoarse from shouting. And me? For the first time in my life, I felt calm. I felt steady. I felt like I had finally grown into the version of myself I always wanted to be. The version who could stand tall against manipulation, who could say no, who could choose her own path without crumbling under guilt. My father turned to me and hissed, "If you walk away from this, you're walking away from this family." And maybe years ago, those words would have broken me. Maybe I would have begged, pleaded, apologized just to keep their love. But now, I looked him square in the eye and said, "If this is what family means to you, using me, lying to me, betraying me, then maybe I am walking away. Because this isn't love. This isn't family." The silence that followed was deafening. My sister sobbed harder. My mother grabbed my arm, but I shook her off. And then, with my husband's arm around me, I turned and walked away. Every step felt like shedding a chain I had been dragging my whole life. Chains of guilt, chains of obligation, chains of manipulation. Each one fell behind me as I walked, toward a future that was mine to shape. That night, instead of the grand reception my parents had planned, my husband and I drove to a quiet little diner. We ordered burgers and fries, and we laughed. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't picture perfect, but it was real. It was ours. And sitting there in my wedding dress, eating greasy fries, I felt more married, more celebrated, and more loved than I ever would have in that overpriced hotel ballroom. The fallout with my parents wasn't pretty. For months, they tried to guilt me into paying some portion of the bill. They called, they sent messages, they even had relatives reach out, trying to pressure me. But I stood my ground. I reminded them, over and over, that I never signed anything, that it wasn't
responsibility. And when they realized they couldn't break me, the calls grew less frequent. Eventually, they stopped. My relationship with my sister never fully recovered either. She said she understood, but there was always tension after that night. Maybe part of her resented me for not bailing our parents out. Maybe part of me resented her for not standing by me when it mattered most. Whatever the reason, the bond we once had faded, replaced by a polite but distant connection. As for my husband and me, that night became the foundation of our marriage. We learned early that life wouldn't always be fair, that people, even family, could betray you. That sometimes you had to fight for what was right, even when it meant losing people you thought you could never live without. But we also learned that, together, we were stronger than the lies, stronger than the manipulation, stronger than the weight of anyone's expectations. Sometimes I think back on that day and wonder what would have happened if I had caved, if I had paid the bill, if I had let them use me once again. Maybe things would be different. Maybe my parents would still be speaking to me. Maybe my sister and I would still be close. But deep down, I know I would have carried that resentment forever. It would have poisoned my marriage, my peace, my sense of self. Choosing myself, choosing to walk away, choosing to let them face the consequences of their own actions, that was the real wedding gift I gave to myself. Now, whenever I see wedding photos, I don't just see a bride in a dress. I see a woman who finally stood up for herself. I see someone who learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. And that love doesn't always mean staying, it sometimes means leaving. In the end, my parents paid the $83,000 bill themselves. It nearly drained their savings. And yes, I heard from cousins and aunts that they complained about it for years. But it wasn't my burden anymore. I refused to let it be. I started my marriage debt-free, and more importantly, free from the chains of manipulation. And that, to me, was priceless. Even now, years later, whenever someone tells me a story about being pressured by family, about being guilted into doing something they can't afford or don't want, I tell them my story. I tell them about the wedding that wasn't just a wedding. It was a battle, a breaking point, and a rebirth all in one. And I tell them what I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your life. And you certainly don't owe anyone $83,000 just because they decided to make choices for you. Sometimes loyalty comes at too high a price. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to walk away, even if it means walking away from the very people who raised you. And as I close this chapter in my memory, I can say with certainty, I don't regret it. Not one bit.